It's my privilege, my honor, and my delight to introduce the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center, Crystal Downing.
Thank you, co-director. And some of you missed his great line where he said, "Abandon all hope, ye who do not turn off your cell phones." So that gets a little bit of Dante into our introduction. I'm going to keep this brief. Many of you heard our two fantastic intellects speaking last night, and Jerry Root, too. No, he has a great intellect, too. But you can hear him many times, whereas we had these authors who have made an impact on C.S. Lewis studies, who flew over from Britain to be with us, both of them priests. Dr. Malcolm Guite, an Anglican priest, Dr. Michael Ward, a Catholic priest. Dr. Guite teaches at Cambridge, Dr. Ward teaches at Oxford, but both of them have been influenced profoundly by C.S. Lewis, and it has generated new insights. Dr. Ward, in the form of his award-winning book, Planet Narnia, and Dr. Guite, in terms of his own creative efforts, 5 books of poetry, as well as a rock career. So they are going to be talking about Dante's view of the heavens as well as C.S. Lewis's. But first, we are going to have a few words about the sponsorship of this fine event, the Muriel Fuller Endowment for the Imagination and the Arts. And to introduce the person who made this possible, I will introduce who I consider the Beatrice of our evening, Marjorie Meade.
Just to build on Crystal's introduction very quickly, you can hear Jerry Root here this year in several lectures, 3 lectures related to our Hansen lectureship beginning early November on C.S. Lewis's Dimer. So make sure you put that on your calendar. It is a joy to be able to introduce David Fuller to you this evening. It's been just wonderful getting to know him this past day or so, and previous to this via emails and conversations on the phone. But through his connection with the Esmond Nissim Foundation, David has generously made possible the Muriel Fuller Endowment for the Imagination of the Arts, which is the reason we can be here tonight and we can have Malcolm and Michael with us. A graduate of Wheaton College, class of 1961, David was a political science major here and went on to receive his JD in law from the Harvard Law School. David is a partner and attorney at Bosworth, Gray, and Fuller in Bronxville, New York, and has been with the firm since 1994. He practices in a number of areas, including criminal law, employment law, estate planning, intellectual property law, litigation, appeals, personal injury, and real estate law. You can see he is a multifaceted gentleman. David and his wife Isabel have 4 adult children and 4 grandchildren. His parents, Reverend Dr. David Fuller and Virginia Emery Fuller, were graduates of Wheaton College, as was his Aunt Muriel, for whom this endowment is named. Please join me in welcoming David Fuller, who will share some memories of his Aunt Muriel with us. David.
Well, I'm very happy to be here this evening, and I'm also very happy to talk about my aunt and pleased about the endowment that promises to bring a lot of excitement and a lot of energy to the program and to the Wade Center. I think I have to bring you to Brooklyn Heights in 1901, August 25th, 1901. That's when Muriel was born. And if you were in Brooklyn Heights today, it would look pretty much the same way it did, I'm sure. In 1901, there wouldn't be horses, but They're all the old brownstones are there, the churches, the schools, the banks, and different names, but same buildings. And so you can just imagine how it was then, just very calm. And she was born, the first child of David Fuller, my grandfather, and also Olive Muir. Now, soon after she was born, they had to keep the news from my aunt, from my grandmother, of the assassination of the shooting first, and then later killing of William McKinley. And that was something that they didn't want to tell her, but she finally learned. And it was kind of tense during those times. But to get back to Muriel, she was born into this family where her mother was also very much interested in literary things. She published a novel when she was in her late teens, and also another one in her 20s. And her last name was Muir, M-U-I-R, and she inflicted on my aunt the name Muriel, spelled M-U-I-R-I-E-L. And Muriel suffered through that. They tried to preserve the family name that way. Suffered through that through Wheaton, and then went back to the usual spelling. Her grandfather was John Muir. This is John Muir, not to be confused with the great naturalist, John Muir, but they did know each other and considered themselves cousins. And he was a stockbroker, and Muriel wrote a biography of her grandfather when she was in her 20s. So she was born into this family where her father was a dentist and had served with the New Hampshire Volunteers during the Civil War. And when she was born, he was 62 years old. The Fullers liked to summer in Northfield, Massachusetts. There was a conference ground there established by D.L. Moody. And they met there, the Howard family from Philadelphia, who were generations publishing the Sunday School Times. And they were about the same, the children were about the same age, and they all sent children to Wheaton. And it was good that they kept in touch through the years. When one of the grandchildren, Elizabeth Howard Elliott, published her book about the martyrdom of her husband, Jim, Muriel helped them get a publisher, Harper and Brothers, now Harper and Row. When Muriel was 8, they moved. My grandfather retired. They moved to western North Carolina, this Great Smoky Mountains, and Muriel graduated from Asheville High School. There's the family there. It's not necessarily geared talks, but you can see Muriel and my father, David, and there's the father and mother. I like to think that my grandfather looked younger than 62, but maybe he didn't. But anyway, or there he would have been more like 66. But anyway, so she started Wheaton in 1919 after graduating from Asheville High School. And she was very much impressed at Wheaton by a professor, an English professor named Elsie Storrs Dow. And she said Elsie Storrs Dow could have been in any institution, any educational institution that looks like a graduation picture, by the way, probably from Asheville High School or possibly from Wheaton. And she learned so much and just commended Elsie Dow to anyone she talked to about literature. And as you know, she later became a very good friend of Clyde Kilby, who was also a professor of English and who's, of course, the one behind our whole center here. That's Margaret Landon. Margaret Landon was her roommate in college. What's that?
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so they were roommates, and Margaret was Margaret Mortensen, but she went to Bangkok with her husband Ken. He was graduate class of 24, and she wrote to Muriel about how she had found these books in Thailand that had really been banned, but they were talked about a governess that came from the British Isles to be the guardian of the children of the king. And so she thought of writing this book, and Muriel encouraged her. And if you read the acknowledgments in the book, Anne and the King of Siam, you'll see a lot of reference to Muriel, because she talks about how the book got off the ground. And they made sure that whenever there were subsidiary rights, that if you ever see a play on Anne and King of Siam or the movie, you'll see that it always says, based on the novel by Margaret Landon, Anne and the King of Siam. Muriel, this class of 23 that Muriel was in, had some people whose names might be familiar to you. For instance, remember Coach Corey, Ed Corey, the gymnasium's named for him. He was the president of the class of 23. And then there was Enoch Dernis, who was the registrar when I was there, when I was at Wheaton. So Muriel, after she graduated, as you know, we talked about, she changed had her regular spelling of the name, but she worked for Rand McNally for the juvenile department. Now that's by the time she got to New York. That we're a little ahead, but we'll get there very soon. That's along Riverside Drive in Manhattan. But Muriel worked for Rand McNally in Chicago in the juvenile. She always liked juvenile literature, the juvenile literature department. And then just around the time of the crash, arrived in Manhattan. She lived in a walk-up apartment, a 4-flight walk-up, and she never married or learned to drive a car, but she did a lot with books and a lot with helping people write books. And she had 15 books dedicated to her. One was an author that she worked with, who Frank Yerby, who had written a book, The Fox of Harrow, and it was a very popular book among young black youths. She also helped Betty Blackstone, who was class of 27 at Wheaton, who wanted to write an autobiography about her time in China. And I was interested in particular that Betty Blackstone, the Presbyterian minister, knew Eric Liddell in China. They were they were there in the same group there. In the summer, she said she observed that Eric Liddell could play tennis very well. So I'm glad he was a good tennis player as well as a world-class runner. Essentially, Muriel did 3 things when she was in New York. She worked for publishers. She worked for Red Book. She worked for the Christian Herald. She worked for Thomas Nelson at various times. But what she really liked to do was to help people write, be a literary editor. And she would not only edit, but find a publisher for these books. And she also went to writers' conferences to help people and taught writing at Columbia University and at Hunter College. So she really kept very busy. Muriel herself didn't really write that many books. She published certain books. For instance, she did a book on favorite fairy tales for children. She did that. She did a reference work, More Junior Authors, that I understand is still used in the schools. And she co-authored a book, Lady Editor. She also had a book on the zodiac. She was interested in the signs of the zodiac. But she had one book that she published that did really quite well in the 40s. And this started out because not driving a car where you wouldn't want to drive so much in Manhattan anyway, but she took the subway a lot. And she noticed when you went from Grand Central Station to Times Square in the shuttle that there were 4 tracks, but she only saw 3 trains there. She said, now I wonder why that is. And 4 tracks is kind of boring anyway, going back and forth. And she surmised that maybe the 4th track was supposed to be used by a shuttle train that ran away. So she wrote the book called The Runaway Shuttle Train. And it was really this shuttle train had quite a joyride throughout Manhattan, and everyone was wondering what it was doing there. And it was quite well illustrated, too. She didn't do the illustration. She got a good illustrator. And so that really did quite well, The Runaway Shuttle Train. Well, that was really, essentially, you wanted to hear about her, what Muriel did as far as helping people and going to writers' conferences. But I thought I'd just mention a few things in closing. I don't want to take all the time away from these great speakers we have, but I do want to make sure you get some idea about the person Muriel was, very independent, happy. So when she was older, maybe, well, I'd say in her 80s, she was living in an apartment, still 4-flight walk-up, still working. The neighbors were noticing that she wasn't coming out of her apartment. You know how they are. People you don't know it, but when you're in an apartment in the building, people, they kind of keep track of you one way or another. So they called the emergency people. They came in and they knocked they couldn't get in, so they broke in the door, and Muriel was lying there, but she was alive. And so the emergency person, they were trying to get her to talk. She didn't want to talk. She didn't like have her privacy invaded. But Muriel was, in her own way, always ready to give her witness, her Christian faith. And so in this case, a man hit on the right question. It was, how long have you been laying there? And there was one word that came back, lying. So after that, she didn't really talk. She didn't really talk much anymore. And the man said to her, "Well, you better start answering our questions." She said, "If you don't let us help you, you might even die." And she said, "I don't mind. I know where I'm going." And he said, "Well, now we really know there's something wrong with you." And he decided that he'd better take her to the hospital, and they took her there. And she went for a few days. They gave her something to eat, and we had to get someone to come in and make sure she would get her meals, but she still wanted to live alone. And that took care of that episode. But Muriel had also told me that when she was growing up, that it was too bad that the school that her mother went to, it was just on the other side of the street, St. Anne's, had been sold to the school that her mother attended, which had a nice fancy name, the collegiate school for girls. Now it's the collegiate school for boys and girls. But every day, at noontime, it used to play the chimes without fail, the tune of "Jesus shall reign where'er the sun doth its successive journeys run." And so it was bought over by the school, and they didn't have that anymore. And she had really a very strong faith. And I thought in closing, I would just read to you what she had. She died just short of her, just a couple days short of her 95th birthday. But she had this thing that I hadn't seen before. But she had just written something that was her ideas to what happened after she left this life. It's called "Into Thy Hands." This is her work here. She says, think of stepping on the shore and finding it heaven, of taking hold of a hand and finding it God's hand, of breathing a new air and finding it celestial air, of feeling invigorated and finding it immortality, and passing from storm and tempest to an unknown calm, of waking and finding it home.